So during spring 2020, many of you, or at least I was, keeping very busy, binge watching Netflix, trying to figure out how my microphone worked for Zoom calls and failing miserably, and also finding new ways of how to make Jeff Bezos much more rich than he is or has ever been. There was a small group that was being very active in demonstrations and even in some way reenacting the Paris Commune. I'm talking about what was later called the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which was a small area of downtown Seattle which was occupied and made into some form of free zone where police were not allowed to enter, where the municipal workers entered only being allowed to do so. It was basically a part of the United States, which was, in a sense, completely autonomous. And this was a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, even though some anarchist activists were active in this as well, so it wasn't only a BLM thing. But that autonomous zone, I think, in a way, portrayed what the ideas of Black Lives Matter would be if they were implemented in practice. So it's an interesting thing to study more closely, because I think in some ways revolutions of today are much more digital. They're not very physical, or sure they can be, as we've seen in Syria and in other places. But Black Lives Matter was mainly a digital movement. It was mainly a movement in media. Fittingly, it began as a hashtag in the same way as Me Too began as a hashtag. Much of our activism is coupled with words, with concepts and meaning, pictures, activism on Instagram. But with CHAZ, the autonomous zone, we could actually see what was happening in practice. What if you actually implement the ideas that only are spread through Twitter or Instagram? And there were a couple of moments in CHAZ that were documented by people going there and filming with their phones, which I think in a way depict what BLM is in practice beyond the slogans about defunding the police or righting the wrongs of history. And there was one situation where, because CHAZ, the Capitol Hill area, part of it is a big park. And so one part of the park was people were standing in line, and there were only white people standing there. And they had face masks on, of course, all they had. And they were standing there and protecting the area on the other side and not admitting any white people to there, which was reserved for people of color. And the person that was filming the whole situation asked the people there, "What are you doing? And why aren't you allowing any white people going in?" And they were saying that people of color need a safe zone. They need a safe spot where they can be completely comfortable in the midst of their brothers and sisters, and that it's important to create those kind of safe spaces. And of course, the irony of that is that for many decades there were safe spaces. There were safe spaces for whites where blacks couldn't enter. And this was, in a way, an attempt to right the wrongs of yesterday by using the mistakes of yesterday. And one of the other results of the whole CHAZ autonomous zone was that quite a few companies were picking up on what was happening there. You have to understand, this was a very popular movement. The autonomous zone was weird, and many shops were destroyed during the time. Crime went up, but the whole BLM movement was very inspirational. During June 2020, the support among the American population for BLM was around 70%, which was natural because the death of George Floyd, which ignited the whole entire movement, was horrendous, and it really showed how bad police brutality can be in the United States. But what also happened was that this was a pivotal moment for a movement that for a long time had been completely internet-based and academic-based, going through the institutions for a long time, through post-colonial studies, minority studies, black studies, women's studies, and so forth. And when it came to CHAZ and the ideas were tried in practice, they got a lot of support in society. Large companies went out trying to support BLM in any way they could. Even Swedish payment company Klarna, which is valued to several billions, tried to catch on in some way. And they did a campaign where they said that we will make a list of black-owned companies who you can shop from, which was also, in a way, an inversion of what had been done before, because in the 30s in Germany you had a list of Jewish-owned companies so that people would know that you don't shop from Jews. And this was an attempt to invert that. But the problem with this movement, I think, and the iconoclastic wrong of it was that attempting to dismantle the institutions that BLM thought were racist, structurally racist, many of the problems of yesterday, of structural racism, weren't really dismantled. They were only changed, and the contents of who was the wrong person or the group that had to be in some way marked out and blamed was only inverted. And instead of being a movement against capitalist oppression, capitalism was in a way co-opted. It wasn't that you wanted to destroy capitalism and dismantle the whole market economy. I think many BLM activists would rather be in the boardrooms. They preferred that. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the movement, in a sense, had two very, very different groups. One which was primarily working class, and which had their aspirations were for local and municipal changes to the local policies in the United States, and some that were much more symbolic and discursive. They wanted to change how companies talked about race, how minorities were portrayed. And they weren't really interested in changing the material foundations of society and the situation for poor black people. And the middle class wing of this entire movement is it has survived because CHAZ lived for 1 month. And it was very activist, it was very down to earth, and even if you had this strange combination of middle class, educated, white elites combined with people of color that had lived through structural racism, had been confronting police brutality, which is very real in the United States. The thing that survived all this was the social media aspect of it. Now, 2 years on, what we can see is mainly the influence on popular culture, how large multinational corporations had done like diversity officers, inclusivity guides, and stuff like that. But the main issue, the problem of racism, isn't really addressed. The main problem for black inner city populations are other poor black people that are in the same horrible situation with poverty, with drug abuse. That hasn't changed a lot. The iconoclasm of the BLM movement was very symbolical. It didn't really touch upon the material foundations. And in a way, the ideological background of the whole movement was rooted in like a changed version of Marxism and Leninism and socialism, but it was completely devoid of the more the economic base, the attempt to try to completely subvert class society, capitalism. And the strange thing is that the main institution which was targeted in Black Lives Matter manifestos was the police. Defund the police was the main slogan. And the police was, in practice, defunded during the CHAZ month. Crime went up. Several shootings occurred in the area. which of course it made it very hard for the police to go in because they weren't really allowed to go in. They were afraid that there could be clashes with the people being active there. And the Defund the Police slogan was actually tried in many other places in the United States, locally, where the budget for the police was lessened or funds were redirected to social projects. And it wasn't very popular, not even among minority groups. And I think the strange thing about BLM was that it was based on a real valid observation that some institutions have large problems. But the solution was to completely dismantle institutions. It isn't a progressive movement, really. It's more of a revolutionary movement without the means to make an actual revolution. So it comes up with very, very radical slogans, who then other groups in society, media, culture, pop culture, try in some way to accommodate. You know, people had Black Lives Matter banners on their pages. They changed their Facebook pictures and stuff like that. But it was they were trying to get on the bandwagon without really addressing the topics at hand that were being raised by BLM. And I think one of the main takeaways from that year, 2020, and the visible side of BLM was that we're living in a very, very word and symbol heavy area of our civilization. The toppling of statues, which we've seen in the United States and in Great Britain, is a very minor part of that. The main thing is trying to change words, trying to change concepts, trying to change our discourse on Twitter or in other places. And in a way, I think we can be thankful that the revolutions of the 21st century are much more focused on appearances, on words, than actual bloody, violent revolutions, which we had in the past. But in a way, it also raises the question of how can social change be brought up and developed when it's so focused nowadays on the symbolical and the discourse heavy part of social change. BLM is really, I think, will be seen as our 1968, 91, 1917. But in a way, it will be remembered as quite impotent because it wasn't really subverting our institutions. It was mainly commenting on them and then trying to be part of them. Perhaps that's one of the mistakes of having a class revolution which is mainly founded on the middle classes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you explain a little more how BLM relates to iconoclasm? You just touched briefly on it and said there was some kind of link, but I didn't really get it.
So I think it wasn't really visible during 2020, but if you read the ideological underpinnings of BLM, basically the entire Western society is completely corrupt and built on the backs of the poor. Mm-hmm. So all institutions in Western society, all symbols of Western meritocracy, be it statues, politicians, are symbols of this oppression and have to in some way or another be toppled.
But the movement must have realized that toppling statues didn't change anything in reality in their lives. So why didn't they go further and they have the icon part of it, but why not the clasm part of it?
Because I think that a generation raised on the algorithm-ridden machinations of modern capitalism are, in a way, I think, diverted from real struggle. Mm. If you think that you make a change by popularizing hashtags and doing like mass movement things on the internet, you're diverted away from things that actually matter in the material world.
But what will people remember, Black Lives Matter or the storming of the Capitol?
the storming of the Capitol. It was visible. It was, in a way, violence against an institution in a very visible manner. Many social movements of our age will be forgotten because it's so hard to document digital traces. So it's an iconoclasm that will be hard to document in comparison with what happened in Afghanistan with the Buddha statues, which are both visible remains of our culture, but also the destruction is very visible.
Thank you for adding this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.